So it's not just random countries. It's countries like Turkey, like you just saw, that funnel weapons into Syria as well that the U.S. is selling weapons to in the first place. So instead of finger pointing, perhaps there's a need to rethink policy, or at least take a closer look at the consequences of these actions. I've got Ivan Eland, a senior fellow at the Independent Institute, here to help me break some of this down. Ivan, let's talk about this stance by the U.S. Selling arms to Middle Eastern countries on one hand, while simultaneously criticizing countries that are selling arms to other ones.
Well, unfortunately, the U.S. has a double standard in this regard, and you see it in Syria. As your tape story mentioned, this is in Bahrain. This is exactly what happened. We not only gave it to the Bahrain government, but of course Saudi Arabia invaded Bahrain and helped the government put down the protesters there. And of course, Saudi Arabia is one of our biggest arms recipients. Also, Mubarak's Egypt. The United States was slow to embrace the protesters, but then when they did, of course, it was still the arms that were in contention, which were hovering over the entire situation, and which still hover over the entire situation in Egypt. Are U.S. Most of them are U.S. built, because we give a lot of military aid to Egypt.
And it seems like, from what I'm reading, right now, yesterday, just in the last 24 hours, we have heard a bipartisan group of senators. It's funny what actually brings the two parties together. It's being led by John McCain and Joseph Lieberman, and they're asking and they're calling on. They've put forth a proposal to start arming the anti-regime people in Syria. And so it's just really interesting. I mean, how do you think this looks from the outside looking in when the U.S. criticizes countries for selling arms to governments they don't like, but they're willing to arm the people that are fighting those governments?
Well, yeah, a lot of times, the opposition people will take the arms, but they're still leery of U.S. Intentions. And in fact, in Syria, you could end up with something worse than the current regime as far as human rights go. And there's also the issue of state sovereignty. I mean, if you break down the system of world sovereignty over countries over their own borders, you start running into a problem, because this is not a perfect system. Sometimes regimes do abuse their own people, but the state sovereignty system, where you stay out of other people's business, that's sort of the bedrock of the international system. Otherwise, we might have perpetual war. And so that's why that's been set up. It's a hard-nosed reality that sometimes there are these issues where a regime is not nice to its people. But on the other hand, the United States has been on the other side of this, supporting repressive governments more than on the side of the protesters, usually, over the history of the U.S. Since World War II. I think the United States has preferred friendly regimes rather than democratic ones.
Pretty interesting point there, and we saw that with Libya as well. Sending that support into people who may have been anti-Gaddafi, but we don't know really who they were, and that's the question. And not only when it comes to our government, but when it comes to some of the weapons manufacturers here in the U.S., to what extent do they have an obligation? People like Raytheon and Boeing, can they just do business as usual, or do they actually have an obligation to figure out who they're selling their weapons to?
Well, they'll sell them to whoever they think they can sell them to, if the U.S. government permits it. And so a lot of times the government permits it simply because these companies have tremendous lobbying power on Capitol Hill. And whether that's a good idea or not, a lot of U.S. armaments went to the Afghan rebels in Afghanistan to fight the Soviet Union. Those were made by American manufacturers, but that turned out to be not such a great idea, spawning al-Qaeda. And many times you get unintended consequences for doing this. We armed Iran for years under the Shah, and then all of a sudden it flipped. We may have the same situation in Egypt. We don't know yet what's going to happen there. If the Muslim Brotherhood takes over the country, you may have an unfriendly regime with U.S. Weapons there. So it's very dicey to do this, but you see it's really a domestic issue, not a foreign issue, because these companies have tremendous lobbying power. And of course, with the recession and everything, there's a there's even more pressure to export, and one of the things that the U.S. Exports is arms.
Absolutely. In fact, last year, I'm not sure if it was a record, but it was definitely a high, nearly $35 billion in the foreign sales of U.S. weapons. And these are companies, again, like Boeing, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon. Now, I know that recently there was an announcement to some proposed budget cuts to the Pentagon. So what happens if these large companies, we know they're not going to accept less profits than they made the previous year. What happens when, the Pentagon stops giving them as much money as they're used to? What will they then, where will they export these weapons to continue to make money?
Well, there'll be more pressure to export because if they're losing revenue from the Pentagon here domestically, then they'll say, well, gee, you don't want the economy to go south. We're already seeing arguments that we need to keep defense spending high for the economy, but if that doesn't happen, then the companies are going to go, well, we could provide jobs in this state or that district if you just let us export a little more. Just open the gates, let us export. So there will be more pressure to export if the Pentagon budget is being cut at home.
What's the biggest concern you think Americans should have about what we're seeing here?
Well, I think the unintended consequences of all this. What happens if Assad does get overthrown? The Israelis were originally very cautious about this because they didn't really know what was going to follow, and I think that was probably the best policy, is to be a little cautious. But sometimes the United States gets ecstatic about doing in a longtime adversary, and I think that's what happened in Libya. Muammar Gaddafi had started to play the West game. He gave up his nuclear program. He was making amends with the West. Yet we had this opportunity when an internal revolt to overthrow him. I think the same thing was Assad. That it's just irresistible not to go after this guy who we've built up as an enemy over time. Now, it's a totally artificial enemy, and we shouldn't be doing this sort of thing, but I think that's the temptation is, and you see a lot of pressure in the U.S. to actually create a no-fly zone or actively take military action, but people are saying, well, this is Syria, this is not Libya, Syria's right in the middle of Israel, Turkey, all these key players in the Middle East. Maybe we ought to be a little more cautious. So that's why you see this movement to do something a little less than that, and that's get weapons to them. But they can do that surreptitiously because oftentimes what the U.S. does, it gives weapons to it encourages its allies to export weapons surreptitiously and then says, well, we'll replenish your stocks. That way the U.S. can keep its fingers clean, so to speak. And that's what may be happening with Turkey as far as selling or giving weapons to the Syrian opposition.
Right.
It's a muddled situation. We don't know what's happening. But given past history, that might be one way that it will shake out.
Certainly interesting when you look at sort of the criticisms being launched versus some of the actions being taken. There's a fine line with what's going on. Ivan Eland, Senior Fellow at the Independent Institute.